Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little for PokerNews.com. I want to thank you for being here with me today. Today we are going over a deep stacked hand. We are playing about 100 big blinds deep at 200-400 with a 50 ante. As you see, I have more than 100 big blinds, but the player I'm going to be playing against has 100, so that is what is most relevant. We get Jack 10 of diamonds and raise it up to 1,050 from the low jack seat. I typically make it a little bit bigger in this spot, usually about 3 big blinds when playing deeper stacked, so I would like to see me do that, but any raise size is fine with Jack 10 of diamonds. You are always looking to play this hand. It is great. So I do open it up, and now the button 3-bets. So this is a spot where I'm pretty much always calling. I have to put in 1,800 into a pot that's going to be about 6,000. So will I realize my equity a third of the time? And I definitely will with Jack 10 of diamonds. If your opponent's really tight, you could consider folding. But even then, I'm still just going to call and see a flop the vast majority of the time with this hand. I don't think we need to bluff it by 4-betting, and I'm just not going to fold. So we're going to call and see how things go. We get a very clear marginal made hand. With a very clear marginal made hand, which is often going to be the case when you have middle pair, usually you're looking to check call 1-bet and then see what develops. This is a spot where I'm virtually never folding because, well, the jack's almost certainly good on the turn, and also we could pick up a straight draw, or even a diamond is pretty decent. So I'm going to check and check call pretty much any reasonable bet. When it goes check, I think my opponent now should have a lot of marginal made hands, or perhaps ace-king, or maybe a hand like ace-10. So against that range, should I bet the turn? I certainly could if I thought my opponent was primarily going to fold these hands that have some equity. Although, I also think just checking is fine, because notice I am pretty sure what cards are bad for me on the river, right? I really just don't want an ace or a king to come. Any other river is good enough. If the river's a 10, I will value bet it, but then I will probably fold to a raise, or I'll check looking to check call. Make sure you don't really overcommit yourself whenever you make 2-pair. You'll see some amateur players like bet when the river's a 10, get raised, and then go all in, and that's just an atrociously bad play, because you're only going to get called when you're crushed. So don't do that. So instead, we're just going to check. On the turn, with a diamond, I can very easily check, looking to check call. I'm never ever folding when I turn a backdoor flush draw. So the only real question is, should we value bet this? And I think it's close. You can go either way depending on what you think about your opponent. So I do check. The opponent bets 3,500 into the 6,500 pot, and I make the very easy call. We get there on the river with the ace, giving us a flush. That's good. A lot of people use the strategy of leading whenever they make their flush, or when they have a flush draw and they miss. People tend to do one of the two. Not very many people lead in both scenarios, which makes them really easy to play against. I typically don't do a whole lot of leading in these spots, mainly because if you lead, what should your opponent do? Well, if he's sitting here with nothing, he has a pretty easy fold. If he has an ace, he has a pretty easy call, but he's probably going to bet that ace anyway. If he has a queen, yeah, he's going to check behind, but he probably isn't going to pay off a big bet with a queen on an obviously bad river like this. Same thing with a jack, right? So it's really hard to get paid by leading, but if we check, our opponent's certainly going to value bet a lot of 1- and 2-pair hands that are top pair or better, and he may also bluff sometimes. So I think this is a great spot to check. There's certainly spots where your opponent's going to check behind with all of his decent hands, like say they have pocket aces on a board that's something like 7, 6, 4, 3, 9, right? That's the spot where your opponent's almost always going to check behind if they're good. So in that scenario, if you river a straight or a flush, maybe you do want to lead, just because your opponent should be checking back a ton, and they should also not be bluffing in that spot too often. But here, our opponent should be bluffing a ton, and he should also be value betting a ton. So I definitely like checking on this board. You always want to think about, how does your hand play in relationship to your opponent's range, right? And how does the range connect with how does your opponent's range connect with this board? And in this scenario, our opponent can very easily have a lot of good hands, so I want to check. Don't just think, oh, I lead with my flushes, or I never lead with my flushes, because that's not good poker. So anyway, I check. Opponent bets 6,750, about half pot. And now I have to decide if I want to raise or call, and I'm just going to raise this pretty much every time. Whenever you make the backdoor flush, especially compared to when you make a regular front door flush, you definitely want to raise. This is a spot where a lot of people will not give you credit for the backdoor flush because they assume you're not going to... Well, actually, our opponent checked behind on the flop, so there's no reason why I couldn't have all the backdoor flush draws. So In this scenario, our opponent should actually suspect the backdoor flush some portion of the time, but in general, they don't see it coming, right? People don't look for these backdoor draws, and when you do get there, you usually get paid. So if I had any flush right now, I would definitely check raise it, even if it was a low flush, like 6-high flush somehow. Don't be afraid of being beaten in these spots. If you do check raise and your opponent goes all in, well, that's a miserable spot, and you probably need to fold. Do not be a calling station unless your opponent is really aggressive or just really oblivious. Like if your opponent's going to go all in with king 10 here because he thinks it's the nuts, well then clearly you have to call off with all of your flushes or most of your flushes. But if your opponent's only going to be jamming with mostly nut hands and maybe a few bluffs with the king of diamonds, then I think you can justify folding. Anyway, we have to make a check raise to an amount that he can conceivably call. I decided to go pretty big this time. I'm not actually sure I like this. He bet 6,500. I go to 23,000, which is not a gigantic raise, but notice it really is making our opponent feel like they're risking their whole stack. When I am check raising in this spot, especially against amateur players, if I'm going for value, I do everything I can to not make them feel as if their whole stack is at risk. Because if their whole stack is at risk, a lot of people are going to make somewhat snug folds. Of course, some people will look at this and say, oh, you're obviously trying to bluff me, so I'm going to call every time. So it's hard to know what people are thinking, and for that reason, I just don't assume anything about their strategy. And I think that's usually going to be a pretty good thing to do. But I would have liked a smaller raise here. If I make it this size, I do think our opponent's going to fold out everything besides 2-pair and better. And if I'm going to make it this size, maybe I should just go all in instead and collect his whole stack when he has 2-pair and better. Because I don't... Well, again, this is tough to say. Will our opponent call an all in equally as often or with the same range that he will call a 23,000 raise? And it's probably close. I think if we make it 15,000, though, our opponent's going to be way more inclined to call with a lot of stuff to where he's just never, ever folding, maybe even an ace. Who knows? So I make it 23K. What happens? Opponent does call. I'm probably going to win. And I do. It's always nice when you get a good river. If the river was an ace that was not a diamond, I would definitely check fold. Same thing if the river was a king, not a diamond, I would also check fold. But every other card on the river is good enough. We're going to be checking, looking to call a bet, and sometimes we're going to lose and sometimes we're going to win. But whenever we get there with that backdoor flush, we're usually going to win. So that's it for this hand for Poker News. I hope you enjoyed it. This wasn't necessarily the most exciting hand ever, but hands like this are really where you win or lose because you play these middle pairs frequently, right? And if you end up butchering your hand every time you get a middle pair, you're just going to be messing up a lot of hands. So make sure you are playing somewhat cautiously, not blasting money in the pot, and instead just kind of hanging out and seeing where things go. And sometimes they go really well. This has been Jonathan Little. Thanks for watching.